Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. Today, we're going to be talking about the 5 signs of the anti-church, and we're going to be reflecting upon the true Church of Christ and making distinctions between the two that I think are so important to make at this time. I have been reflecting upon these ideas for quite a few years. So, really, I'm talking about the totality of my work here on Dr. Deep State, my book, Seeing Through the Singularity, and my forthcoming book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse. If you go back to my videos from about 6 and 7 years ago, I was talking about things that were making connections between writers like Giorgio Agamben, Michael Foucault, Carl Schmitt, and a whole variety of Anglo 19th century thinkers. And I was putting together an idea that I called esoteric biopolitics in the New World Order. And I think at best, people didn't get me. I think people maybe thought I was kind of crazy. But over the last 3 years, many people have come around, and in fact, I see these ideas floated around quite a bit now. So, a lot of these ideas I've also put into my forthcoming book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse. And I have to say, right up front, a lot of the ideas that I'm going to suggest are going to be easy and palatable for some, but a lot of my book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse, is particularly, it's really aimed at preserving the true Church of Christ. And sometimes we use labels like conservative or traditionalists. And some of what I'm going to propose is going to be an affront to some of those people and difficult. And in fact, promoting my book to some of those people. But that is not at all my intention. My intention is to present to you what I believe are the 5 signs of the anti church and what is the fullness of the tradition of the traditional church and the importance of us hanging to the traditions and the understanding of the church that we have received. So, before we begin the 5 signs of the anti church, the big idea here is ultimately that the church of the New World Order will be an inversion of Christ, an inversion of reality. And reality, I define as something that we apprehend through the historical, the hierarchical, and the sacramental. But in all cases, when we're thinking about the 5 signs of the anti church, the question that will come to mind will be by whose authority are these signs made, created, made manifest, essentially. For the Church of Christ, the church that was founded by Christ, the ultimate authority is Christ. So the challenge in our own times of apprehending these changes or making distinctions between the anti-church and the true church, I would argue that we're living in sort of the fog of war, the fog of battle. And there's a crisis in the church. There's certainly a crisis or a confusion in societies generally. And I compared this typologically to the time of the Passion of Christ when the Sanhedrin is whipping up emotions. And when we think of the signs of the Antichrist, we need to somehow sort of stand back from the drama, look at these things historically, separated from their contemporary context and the passions being exchanged, and sort of deliberate on this and kind of make the distinction of Christ versus Barabbas. Reality in its fullest sense versus claims toward reality. So Christ versus Barabbas. And before I began the 5 signs of the Antichrist, ultimately, I'm influenced here by Father Dennis Fahey. Yes, it reflects the totality of Dr. Deep State, all the videos, the book Seeing Through the Singularity, the forthcoming book In Pursuit of the Metaverse. But one of the huge influences on this type of thinking has been Father Dennis Fahey. So there you go. Number 1, evolution. Okay, the New World Order Church will be a church based on evolution. The traditional Christian civilization was not based on evolution. And I could do a whole lecture right now on evolution, but let me just do a few thoughts. Ultimately, here in point A, we're talking about a progressive view of the world, a progressive view of history, a progressive view of hierarchy, a progressive view of the sacraments. And sometimes we call this modernism. Sometimes we say that modernism in the Catholic Church, uh, the church was infiltrated in mid 20th century by modernism. I challenge us to think about that in its fullest sense as I move on in this discussion. But part of modernism is we leave the fullness of reality, including the transcendent frame, and we look at um, the state of the world through a more eminent frame. So essentially, let me make some quick, I think I do need to discuss this a little bit. Some of the basic distinctions of the Christian worldview really comes from this idea of Noah's Ark. First and foremost is that God um, destroyed the world, and this is why we see sort of cataclysmic sort of phenomenon around the world. And creation scientists explain this through the events described in the Great Flood narrative. We see seashells on the top of mountains, and there's a lot of empirical evidence for this, and traditions all around the world have a flood account. So there's good evidence for this. It's not perfect evidence, but it's good. Evolution, of course, is non scientific mumbo jumbo, and I'm talking about macroevolution, the idea that something started from nothing is not scientific. There's zero evidence that things changed from their type. And that's the type that's described here, the animals going two by two. And God's very clear of their kind, of their kind, of their kind. That's how He created the world. And He makes a special point of telling us that with the narrative of Noah's Ark. But progressive theology, or I would say even really evolution, is sneaking in. I notice it in Catholic discourse more among these are tendencies, okay? So I notice it more among the apologists or the Pope splainers trying to accommodate the scientific worldview of millions and billions of years with the traditional account of Genesis and the creation narrative. And in doing so, they end up kind of going in a slippery slope, which kind of moves toward, we have Teilhard de Chardin here, I'll call it Teilhardianism, where he takes on a very heretical um, endeavor to combine the creation account with modern science. And it's a very progressive, heretical. It's where human beings move beyond their type into an ultimate sort of blob of love. It's very similar to the singularity in this idea. So I think that there's a great slippery slope when you give too much. I think the actual empirical evidence, from my view, is that when you look down into the earth, there aren't these gradual formations. The earth seems to be on the young side, 100,000, 30,000, maybe 7,000 years old, which is entirely a different animal than talking about millions and billions of years. The and billions are postulated to explain something that can't be explained, is that there is no evidence between interlocking types within movements within the types, and so they conjecture the millions and billions of years, and it ends up being a religion. And it's ultimately people that put their faith in man more than the revelations of God. So that is a sort of Teilhardianism that I think the new church will accommodate. I believe what's going on in the Synod of Synodalities is based on an assumption that theology evolves, societies evolve, people evolve. And so they won't come right out and claim that we're building this off evolution, but it's implied. It's baked into the cake, I think, of this synodal process. So, we have progressive theology. The theology changes. People can go back and forth and argue if Vatican II, that's what was going on with all of the weaponized ambiguity, but it seems to be the case. Number B, progressive politics. Yeah, it's accommodating. It's the theology with the times of our day, and saying that things could have been created better instead of one perfect revolution that we fine tune and try to apprehend more perfectly over time. It's starting anew, And in that sense, progressive politics is also influencing or working alongside of progressive theology, ahistorical. And the reason that is, it's ahistorical because it's leaving the reality of the revelation announced by God. So this really begins with the French Revolution, the idea of equality, liberty, and fraternity, which is essentially a fundamental error. That's what the modern world, I'm going to suggest here, is founded on this error. When we try to square the church, reality, ultimate truth of the church, it just does not square with modernity. And so I'm thinking of the church in a big term, something that's always been and will live on, even beyond the passion of the church. So it's something bigger than our contemporary politics. So, with this suggestion that's both within the United States Declaration of Independence, it's very similar to the Equality of Man treatise in the French Revolution. Equality and liberty are fundamentally unequals. They both sound good together, but equality is non-hierarchical, and it's a proposition that we're going to ultimately go in this communist direction of destroying hierarchy. It's impossible, and it's an impossible endeavor. And the outcome is always political derailment when we move society in that direction, i.e., socialism and communism. Liberty is the idea that there would be hierarchy. So when you try to square the two, you get ultimately conflict. It's not a proposition that can work in reality, only in the mind. And ultimately fraternity or inclusion. And so the problem there is idealized political society, i.e., Christendom, the idea of integralism. There was no inclusion of air. So, just for the sake of inclusion, you don't include everything. And of course, that's one of the problems going on with the Synod of Synodality right now. So, ultimately, when we have progressive theology, politics is built on theological propositions. We get ultimately an ahistorical political endeavor, and that leads to progressive humanity. And of course, this is the modern project. The Renaissance is really an attempt to recapture these pagan ideas of apotheosis. Human beings become God. That's a proposition of the Renaissance, is that man is the measure of all things. And that leads us to eventually connecting that idea with modern science, which is transhumanism, which is biological and technological, or biological and digital convergence and ultimately congruence, man mixing with machine. And that's embedded in the Enlightenment Project. The Enlightenment Project was ultimately about separating nature and grace to open that doorway. The idea is ultimately transhumanism is a proposition of humanism that comes out of the Renaissance, and eugenics, which is the idea of we can tinker with man to make him beyond man, post-man. And eugenics can be just social engineering, tampering with all of the conditions, external conditions of man, but ultimately it can be going inside of man and changing man's DNA, the DNA that really reflects the image of God. So it's this human attempt to redefine the image of man, the image of God through the image of man. So transhumanism necessarily moves to posthumanism, which is the rejection of the image of God. And I'll just say this: I accepted evolution because I just thought that was, as an agnostic throughout my adult life, I just thought only crazy evangelical people believed in Noah's Ark, and I just never looked at the evidence. I thought it was an open and shut case. When my eyes were open, when I had my conversion, I was open to looking into these things. And if you want to look back, about 6 or 7 years ago, I made videos on this when I was developing the idea of the singularity. I believe I have one called The Lunatics. That is Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, and he was working with a project that would create the Anglo-American Empire. And these were the roots of it. And it was founded upon this idea of progressive theology and evolution. So they had to make the idea of evolution scientific. It was ultimately a repackaged pagan idea, and it would be given a scientific veneer through, of course, the grandson, Charles Darwin, and based upon some very shaky propositions. But when you see it as a conspiracy, these people that were moving together, waiting for the time that would be to drop this idea that humans and monkeys were related, but yet monkeys are still around. It's an idea that once you start looking at it and puzzling, but God creates the world this way. He allows us, if we want to look through the eminent frame, we will see evolution, the scientific paradigm. That's what's offered to us. And when we see it through the transcendent frame, it's like, okay, I see the other half. This whole other narrative is starting to make sense as well. But yeah, it was a conspiracy to interject this idea into the Anglo-American Empire project. And the idea would be tied to Freemasonry and it's all Kabbalah. And the idea is that there isn't, the notion of God is different in the Talmudic Kabbalistic tradition. It's Ein Sof, it's just energy. And it's man that comes along and puts the framework on that. Man builds the types. So man coming in through will of power will create a new type of man. And that's what things like Freemasonry is. It's rooted in Kabbalah. And the will to power and the masters of the economy are going to make a new world and make a new human being. And you'll see it in obviously in the Masonic tradition, which is all about apotheosis. It's heavy in those traditions that came out of Freemasonry, like Mormonism is heavily into progressive theology. They're going to all have their own planets and be a type of God. So it's rooted in those type of societies, and it's most particularly the seed, the very germination of the Anglo-American Empire, and that's at the roots of it. So the ultimate New World Order will be based on a progressive theology, a progressive politics that leads to this final new world. And I'll just say this about this. What we call the builders, these Kabbalists, they're actually typologically, they're the destroyers, because their project has been to destroy Christian civilization so that the phoenix may rise. The problem is this culture of people has never actually demonstrated building a civilization. And so what we have really is a project that is, they're ultimately a parasitic class. They mirror the reality of the true church, and they can put Gnostic counterfeit churches, but they need the host alive. Once they're going to destroy Christendom, they know they're left with nothing. And this is the real puzzle of what they're doing. So that's why it's like an Ouroboros. It's the snake eating its tail into an eternity. And ultimately, what I argue in seeing through the singularity and ultimately in pursuit of the metaverse, the project is only based on manipulating the mind. So the metaverse is a frame of mind because they don't have the tools to create a civilization. If they would, they could. If they would, they would. So let's move on here. Okay, from progressive theology, and argue that this really begins with the heretic Martin Luther. When you say a proposition like sola scriptura, that the scripture can ultimately be read by anybody, this is going to be the ultimate flowering of that idea. LGBT flag, they talk about posting your flag on top of it. This is our building. The guy there on the far right, very trans. It's the beginning of the trans thing. I'm going to be a new kind of person. It's identity politics. Today I identify as a dude in a dress with a mustache and standing next to a dude with a pink belt and purple suspenders. And it's the queasiest part of pride. And here I have, some different scriptures. God hates pride. It's the foundation of all other sins. And so it's just antithetical that these people would be coming out in the name of pride and kind of owning their own church. And what motivates that, in a sense, is beyond me. I think, in a sense, they're really proxy warriors for the Kabbalistic world church. But of course, in Talmudic Kabbalism, they have multiple genders and a lot of room with this God Ein Sof that's just infinity that leads people to define reality. So you can define your gender and move on. And before I move on, I will just say, talk about full circling. So, I mean, this idea didn't really come in till really the late 20th century. And the people that should be preserving the true church, at least on the Protestant side, that the propositions of the Reformation, which are founded on an anti-belief, we're against the mystical body of Christ. But it took several centuries before we got into crazy zone here. But the mainline churches that should be at least defending this tradition, the Methodists, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, they've split in two over this issue. And they become, so half of the church goes into crazy land. And I'm just saying it's crazy land. This is on its face. Just look at that. What it just the picture says it all. Yet there are going to be some people that purport to be Christians of some stripe that will say, oh, okay, that makes sense. That's Church of Tolerance. But we know in the history of violence, violence is usually justified through a certain type of tolerance. And again, when you go into crazy land, things don't have to add up. So what do I have next here? My sister sent this to me a few years back. And so I'm only saying what my sister told me. I see this bandied around in the gay sections of the mainline Protestant church. She said it came originally out of the Lutheran church, which is my own background. And I've seen these changes over the last decade in this church. Some people say the most quote unquote liberal part of it would be the Lutheran church. Of course, there's many divisions within the Lutheran church, and there's more conservative branches, the Missouri Synod and the Wisconsin Synod. But let's get into it. It's called the Sparkle Creed. The Sparkle Creed. I believe in the non-binary God whose pronouns are plural. I believe in Jesus Christ, their child, who wore a fabulous tunic and had two dads and saw everyone as a sibling child of God. I believe in the rainbow spirit, who shatters our image of the one white light and refracts it into the rainbow of gorgeous diversity. Again, hierarchical, historical, sacramental. Okay. I believe in the church of everyday saints, as numerous, creative, and resilient as patches of the AIDS quilt, whose feet are grounded in mud and whose eyes gaze at the stars in wonder. I believe in the calling to each of us that love is love is love. So, beloved, let us love. I'm sorry, I didn't mean, I was going to do this without react. I believe, glorious God, help my unbelief. Amen. And do I have to respond to that? So, um, So it's gone full circle. And now at the Synod of Synodalities, this kind of stuff is sneaking. It's the camel poking its hole in the tent. And for those that have eyes to see there, of course, the Bishop Stricklands of the world are going, this is too far. And the question is, how can the hierarchy of the church, the bishops, the cardinals, not say, I see where this is going? I mean, without seeing the grand Luciferian conspiracy, they see it going on in Protestantism. The direction of the Catholic Church is to move toward the direction, the sparsity, the Puritanism, the simplicity of the Catholic, Protestant theology and theology, or liturgy rather. So how could anybody not see this direction in the church? And this brings us to the number 2 sign of the impending anti-church and the New World Order. And this is the phenomenon of politically correct speech. And we think about politically correct speech, we think about the idea that if our language is controlled, it tends to control our behavior, the social norms, and ultimately our own worldview. But when we speak about or think about politically correct speech, one of the first things we think about is who are the people controlling the language. And of course, this has to do with this idea of a progressive world, the world that's changing. It's going to get better in some way, shape, or form, if we can control the language that will bring us into the right politically correct thought. And the language police, I will suggest, is usually associated with communism. And I'm going to get to this in a moment. but we're seeing it emerge in a powerful way with the political right, in particular from the phenomenon of Zionism. Now, before I continue, I will include 2 links that carefully detail political and social Christian Zionism. They're presented by Sensus Fidelium. They go into great detail. There's 2 separate links so that you can go to that this isn't simply my opinion. These links were made 5 years ago with great detail and great care to explain how insidious, how pernicious, and how ultimately evil this influence it is. It is, in my opinion, the ultimate leaven that has crept into Catholic thinking, and my concern is especially on the conservative and traditional side of things. And so I will address that in a moment. But when we talk about politically correct speech, we're thinking about changing a language. So it's always moving in the direction that the people controlling the language want to push it, which is ultimately toward the destruction of the Christian worldview and into an ultimately new world view and a new world order. It's going to change the social norms. Another way of saying that is immanentizing the eschaton. The eschaton of Christian civilization, everything, our language, our thoughts, our minds, our worldview are always focused on the beatific vision, the afterlife, how we're connected in this life, but it's leading the whole of our own minds and our whole societies toward an ultimate heavenly direction. And that's changed, and it will be immanentized. We're going to focus on the next age, the age to come, the messianic age, which we're aimed toward, will be a ruler of this world. Hence, it will be a biopolitical rule. And this is what we're already captured by. And I've argued this in my book, Seeing Through the Singularity. You can go back and see this on many of my early videos. Biopolitical rule is a rule. It's a control where we police our own minds, our own language, our own behavior from within. We internalize the commands of the people that are essentially controlling the behavior, both in our regular norms and we could call it the deep state, the kind of deeper seated imperative in the political rule of the world. And biopolitical rule comes about in the 19th century. It's taking many mechanisms of social behavior and figuring out ways to internalize it. This is where you get things like Giorgio Agamben and Michael Foucault, among many others that write about this. And it's hitched into the directives of the Anglo Empire, along with essentially this evolutionary Kabbalistic idea of moving the world toward the Messianic era. It's very, very subtle. And this is an immanentized reality where we're going to shift into essentially the secular age that we live in today and beyond, into the Messianic era. And it's really baked into the cake of what I call the spectacle, or we live in the empire of spectacle, which is controlled by biopolitical rule. And so there we have it attached to our media, our textbooks, our devices, our smartphones, which are eventually going to go into ourselves. And that's the merger of, of, of biology and technology and the congruence of each. It's aimed toward the merger of biology and the digital, and it's ultimately that congruence that comes together that is part of the singularity and is ultimately part of the metaverse. So that's where we're shifted constantly through the spectacle to have this changing worldview where we will merge, and that is the order that is rejecting the Christ and therefore preparing us for the messianic age, or the age of the Antichrist. Now, I'm going to continue with a book that was written in 2005 called Our Culture, What's Left of It. This was written by Theodore Dalrymple, and it's especially addressed to the culture in the United Kingdom, English culture, but it's really talking about cultures throughout the world. And by implication, we could think about the Anglo Empire project. that really subsumes the whole world. Now, he's going to aim this toward the idea of communism and connect it with political correctness. I think we have enough information today that we can see the same phenomenon of control at the Zionist piece. When we think about recent events here in America, Nikki Haley or Lindsey Graham, and they're talking about completely tyrannical totalitarian control of social media in terms of what we can say and not say. These same measures are going on in Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and Australia. So it's not by accident, just like over the last four years, that the world is moving in lockstep toward these totalitarian measures. It's the same commanding heights of the economy that are moving us into the messianic age through controlling our language, through controlling our behavior. And this is where it parallels the same changes that are going on in the church with our ecclesiology, with our theology, and our liturgy. They're all coming together. And we see this visibly when we look at what's going on in the papacy and how it's matching the initiatives of the globalists. So, what I'm going to suggest when I do this, when I say the word communist here, it's imperative that we also connect the word Zionist to it, because they're two sides of the same coin. We could call it Nazism. We could call it communism. We could call it political correct, political correct imperative. It's all moving us toward it. And this is where we get tricked by the left-right paradigm. And this is why we get sucked into the immanization, the mimetic pulling of our minds, bodies, and spirits into the temporal, into the discussion of our age, whether it be left or right. And when we think about the true church, it has to transcend the particulars of our age. It even has to transcend the particulars of the Anglo Empire project. So let's get going here. Dalrymple says, political correctness is communist propaganda. Okay, we'll read this is communist Zionist propaganda, and we see the Zionist propaganda today in spades like we never have before. So let's get going. Is communist propaganda writ small? In my study of communist societies, I came to the conclusion that the purpose of communist propaganda was not to persuade or convince, not to inform, but to humiliate. And therefore, the less it corresponded to reality, the better. When people are forced to remain silent, when they are being told the most obvious lies, or even worse, when they are forced to repeat the lies themselves, 9/11, pandemic, Ukraine, democide in the Middle East, they lose once and for all their sense of probity, which means the principles of honesty and decency, really the core of Christian civilization. To assent to obvious lies is in some small way to become evil oneself, to internalize the commands of the people directing controlling the behavior and the politically correct speech that are driving you towards certain social norms and a worldview preparing you for the messianic age. Dalrymple continues, one standing to resist anything is thus eroded and even destroyed. This is why we have to hang on to the seeds of the truth, the fullness of the reality of the true church, because as Dalrymple says, to assent to obvious lies is in some small way to become evil oneself. One standing to resist anything is thus eroded and even destroyed. So the seeds of the true church must remain in us, even as we're being attacked from within, from both political parties, both political sides. We can't, when we hold to one, we will be destroyed. There's leaven in everything. It's biopolitically meshed inside of everything. It's mimetically baked into the cake. Dalrymple continues, a society of emasculated liars is easy to control. And we've seen that very convincingly over the last several years. I think if you examine political correctness, it has the same effect it is intended to. Yes, and we definitely associate it with the communists, but it's very undeniable when we see it with Zionism. Again, I've included 2 links that go into great detail. So, what I'm saying about the relationship between the true church, Catholicism, and Zionism is undeniable. If you listen to both those links, they're very well presented information. So, this is going to be the challenging part of both what I'm about to present and what I'm going to present in my book and who I want to present it to. They can't deny it, but they can avoid speaking to people that present the information, especially forcefully, the way it's presented in my book. So this will be the challenge in my book. And this is why I need support from you all. Because at least there's got to be some patchwork of people that recognize it so that the seeds can be planted. So next, we have hierarchy over authority. So hierarchy over authority. This we see in front of us today. This has been going on. It's been in transition for 50 years inside of the church, but we see it very forcefully today that when arguments are made, especially in the group of people in apologetics, in particular, what we call the Pope-splainers, what we see them essentially doing is taking what the hierarchy currently today says, all their measures that match up perfectly with the globalist imperatives, and they're putting those imperatives over top of 2,000 years of tradition. Hierarchy over the magisterium, hierarchy over what's always been true. Most evidently, we see it just most evidently in terms of homosexuality, trans baptisms, and so forth. Why and how could anybody even suggest such things unless they blatantly are putting hierarchy over tradition? These things have always been held in a delicate balance. I suggest reality and how we apprehend reality. And reality, again, is Christ. It is truth. And truth has a transcendent dimension. Christ, God, lives outside of his creation. He transcends his creation through the incarnation of Christ. He came into our reality and he changed the whole perception. So the totality of reality includes the transcendent realm. Of course, there's a mystery in how this works, and the mystery is held together by looking at the historical, the hierarchical, and the sacramental, and the precious balance that we keep it into in what I've always called the medicacy. It's sort of like the batter's box of holding reality together. When one takes precedent, like hierarchy over tradition, the balance is gone, and we're going to get nutty language and nutty behaviors and nutty worldview. And this is the idea. It's social chaos, it's derailment, and it's the putty that the masters of the economy need to have in order to shape and mold. And that's what the devil does. He can't create, but he can shape and mold the individuals into his own image, into the direction of his own history. So, with the hierarchy over tradition, today we have an evolving ecclesiology, and ecclesiology is how the church sees itself, and especially how it sees itself in relation to the rest of the world. That is changing. It's increasingly going to become, you could call it more Protestant, but really it's becoming more communistic. And we get languages like inclusion and equity and diversity and all these things that are completely out of line with the integral order of Christendom, where God, the imperatives of God that he said with Noah, go and multiply, and I'm going to separate the people into their own kinds throughout their own nation states, but yet there'll be a universal empire of Christ. And there's going to be a delicate balance of that's held in play by a delicate balance between history, hierarchy, and tradition. And so globalism is a crashing of the Christian world order, and it really begins and was set in place through the Protestant Revolution. So we have an evolving ecclesiology that then fires off an evolving theology / doctrine. Those people that are arguing right now that's what's going on in the Synod of Synodality is still somehow a continuity or hermeneutic of continuity. And what we have seen over the last 50 years, if you can change the patterns of what's being done, you de facto change the doctrine. So that's what's really going on. So as long as it's allowed to be practiced, it's going to be practiced more often, and essentially it becomes a change in doctrine de facto. So changing the practices eventually becomes the change of doctrine. So the people that can't see the insidious nature of what's going on today, they're going to insist, the Pope splainers and the apologists, that we still have a hermeneutic of continuity in place, and they're not seeing it. When you change the practices or allow the practices to be changed, i.e., allow some priests to marry homosexuals, or the blessings of same-sex unions, or the blessings of trans people, and so forth, this is de facto changing the doctrine. So we have evolving ecclesiology, we have evolving doctrine, and we have evolving liturgy. And when we think of the sacraments, at some point, it might poke into our heads the idea of the sacraments, even at what point are the sacraments not valid? And this is one of the really central ideas between the church and the anti-church. And I can't say that I have the answer to this, but hopefully there'll be people in the church that are going to be guiding us toward exactly what to do in the future when it becomes so obvious between the church and the anti-church. So, number 4, the new hierarchy. And what I have here might be a little bit triggering. But again, if you're challenged by this, go back and look at the links of Catholicism in its historical, sacramental, and hierarchical workings, and the leaven that has been baked into the Anglo order and now is being subsumed into traditional and conservative, especially Catholicism. So what I'm going to argue, and I have typologically, that what's going on right now is essentially we have the Sanhedrin calling the shots, bringing the church into this new ecumenical new world order, preparing us for to have the church of the new messianic age. So the church itself then is therefore involved in the destruction of the Christian age. And think of the irony of this. Essentially, Christian civilization was created by the church. So when the church acts antithetically to its own mission, it is destroying itself from within. The Sanhedrin is calling the shots. We could call this another word, Phariseeism, but we could call it Zionism. The political control or the political religion of Zionism has infiltrated into the church. We can call it modernism. Yeah, it has a communist element, but it has a Zionist element, two sides of the same coin, moving us into the Messianic era. And where we see this perhaps most clearly when people get too cozy with shows like The Wire, who is a flaming Zionist running that show, and then he's calling the shots for what can be said, the political language on that show. It's okay to criticize the communism. It's okay to criticize certain types of correct speech, but now we see it. The Zionist piece of it also controls our speech. And this week in America, the Democrats went into protest outside the Democratic, this is the left-wing headquarters, and they're objecting to what's going on in the Middle East, and they're hauled off by the police. And it's a red pill moment for them. They're realizing, wow, I thought we stood for life and truth and everything good, and they're getting red pilled right now. And a lot of people need to be red pilled inside of the conservative end of the Catholic Church. And I'm trying to be delicate with how I'm saying this, but it needs to be said. Steve Bannon, flaming Zionist, who wants us to repeat the lies of 9/11, of the pandemic, of Ukraine, and of what's going on today. He stands for the political right, but again, think about it. they're captured by the whole of all political operatives and really all of the West. And so when he speaks, he's not just, perhaps you could say, on The Wire in this show, where some of the people happen to be Catholic. However, a lot of them express that they're into the traditional Mass and so forth. With Steve Bannon, he gets people on his show like Cardinal Zen, like um, Bishop Vigano, like Bishop Schneider. This week he had on the bishop from Tyler, Texas, that we all know. And I saw him recently on a show with John Henry Weston. This is a famous Catholic influencer. And so I've seen this pattern. I'm just giving you one example. Now, I'm not suggesting that Catholics don't go on the show and use his microphone, but please, I'm asking for the awareness that what happens when we yoke ourselves with these kind of people. In one hand, Bannon's going to talk about what's going on in the church, Bishop Strickland, the crisis of the Synod of Synodality. So he gets us thinking. And then in the next moment, he'll drop a line like he did, and he'll repeat all of the lies that I've just suggested. He'll repeat the lies of what's going on in the Middle East. He'll repeat the propaganda and what's going on in the spectacle, the biopolitical and mimetic kind of features that want to pull us into this world and the lies of this world. And it's the program of the Sanhedrin, of the Zionists. And he's telling us that the victims in this case, he's accepting all the lies. The victims are in fact the victims are the villains. We have to be aware of Sharia law coming into the West and taking us over. And these are just the talking points of Zionism. And so he's mixing this with Catholicism, and he's doing this with John Henry Weston. There's no pushback whatsoever. So they talk about these programs and the need for cleansing the East, which is just diabolical. And the next moment, they move the conversation on to the pro-life movement. We can't keep doing this. And I know I'm going to get resistance on this, but it's undeniable that the true church transcends this kind of contemporary politics, and it can and the lies that are going on. So what I want to remind people, it's so easy for people on the conservative wing, on the traditional wing of the church, to talk about the infiltration of modernism, the infiltration of the Freemasons. But Zionism is really at the very core of modernism. And yes, it begins sort of in one sense with Herzl in the 19th century, but I argue in my book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse, it's really the groundwork is framed with a theopolitical framework that will frame the Anglo Empire. And so it goes way back to the roots of Protestantism. It's in there. And we have to be aware of this if we're going to protect the church from the attacks that are going to continue as we're going through the passion of the church, so that beyond this age, those truths and the church are protected. And this brings us into number 5, the 5th sign of the anti-church, the church that will be part of the new world order, part of the Messianic age, and that church will be anti-life. And essentially, what I mean by that is it will reject the image of God, the image that we especially know and recognize through our baptism. It will represent anti-reality, the rejection of history, hierarchy, and the sacraments that they have been in the way, in the manner that they have been presented and balanced throughout the Christian era. And this is the setup for the metaverse. And another simple way of thinking of that is the Internet of Body, where we lose our consciousness as it merges, as our biology merges with the digital, in that congruence, in that conversion. And before I begin, it's anti-life. And the imperative of God, he sets it forth with Noah's Ark when he makes things in their type and says that things are to remain in their type. Go out, be fruitful, and multiply, and spread the image of God throughout the world, and don't pervert the image of God. And that's what's going on here in the Noahide laws. I can't get into the totality of this. These are presented, and oftentimes people on the political right and on the Catholic right and in the traditional world will use this term thinking that it's some kind of representation of a natural law or a healthy convergence of something. A term that's sometimes used is Judeo-Christian culture. And this is a farce. This is, again, the camel poking the nose, making the hole inside the tent to get in there. This is, I will argue, the totalitarian legal framework for the Messianic age. It is highly anti-Christian, highly anti-Christian. And so that law, the Noahide law, is when you read through just the totalitarian nature of this. It's pro-abortion and based upon eugenics, we'll know who has the right to live and who doesn't, who will be aborted and who will not. It goes in conjunction with a vax program for all. This is population control. It's a eugenics project. Who has the right to live? Who has the right to breed? Who has the right to rule? Is all going on with this. And the vax piece of this is the track and trace and surveillance down to the genetic level of your existence. And again, the natural tendency or the direction of this is toward digital convergence and congruence in terms of totality of the population control. And it maps the plans that have been there that are going to realize certain Old Testament scriptures can only be in their inverted, perverse Talmudic form, can only be realized through a technological vision. And again, I don't want to problematize this now. Ultimately, this project is in its essence, it's parasitical, and it mirrors and inverts the prophecies of both the Old and the New Testament. So it truly can't actually build a new civilization. So a lot of this I've argued in Seeing Through the Singularity and in Pursuit of the Metaverse. It's a Ouroboros project. It's really about the demonic control of your language, behavior, your mind through the spectacle to bring your ultimately. It's really about just destroying humanity. That's what the devil wants out of this. But again, point number 5, it's anti-life. It wants to destroy. Ultimately, it's the devil just destroying the image of God and man. It's the devil wanting to humiliate humanity to show God, why did you create these people? You could have been perfectly fine with just living with your angelic creations. They were jealous. They were given, the angelic realm was given free will. They became jealous that God created man, a creation that seemed so evident beneath them. They didn't understand what the totality and the vision of God's plan. And so the work of the elemental spirits, the demonic realm, is to take us down, pull us in our own sins so that we lose track through our own baptism of what we were ultimately made to be, the convergence back to the kingdom of Christ, not the convergence with biology. And the idea that we would reject the image of God so profoundly to want to merge with technology, but we're being seduced into it every day. And of course, our young, and you can see young and old alike, how we're seduced into our smartphones. It's not a long step away to put the smartphones inside of us, we see it all. And that's the convergence that they're going for. And the ultimate goal of this, it seems to be moving into the Messianic era. And perhaps through the tribulation, there is an era where, to some extent, we will be subjected to this totalitarian, totalitarian age. But the project is untenable because the people doing it are incapable of creating a civilization because God didn't make them to do that. They were not made that way. So finally, we got pro-ethnic cleansing, democide, what's going on right now in the East. And this is just the first phase of the realization of the Noahide law. So people that look the other way because the people have brown skin, they don't realize that the people in control, the decision makers, both at the global level and down there at the state level of where this is taking place in the Middle East, the idea is to cleanse the world outside of everybody but their own kind of racial vision. And it definitely and absolutely includes the cleansing of Christianity. And if we can't see that, that's unfortunate. Not many people will dare to read this book by the Israeli historian, journalist, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. But it's an eye-opening because that's what's coming to other people in the world. And that's why Christ had to, suggest, if you don't look out for the least among us, there I am. Christ is also in the most among us, whoever recognizes the image. But when we look the other way, and that is what's going on and especially the political right, and that trickles down to the Catholic right. And we have to separate ourselves from the politics of our day. And we have to be bold in saying what's right. What's going on in the Middle East is anti-life. And we shouldn't, in one side of our mouth, talk about a pro-life rally and then look the other way when these are happening to our, biblically, typologically speaking, these are our neighbors. There's life over there, and we should protect life, and we should protect policies that protect life, and not just be corralled by the powers that be into, okay, now you can look in the domestic sphere of pro-life movement over here, but don't look over there. That's not what Christ wants us to do. We do live in terms of the spectacle, we are able to see, we want to be in the world, but not of the world. We're able to see this is going on, and how we respond will affect the life of the true church. And we have to address this leaven inside of the true church. And frankly, we have to rid ourselves of it. And really, that's what I have for you here today. This ends up coming upon a question that is really the totality of Father Dennis Fahey's work. It includes the theme running through all his work was Christ's kingship. And this is really a central feature of Christendom that's been lost. And yes, in one sense, history does not go backwards. But it's so important, the reason that he said what he did and described the Luciferian Kabbalistic conspiracy that he did is that we have to have in our hearts and our minds the seeds of what's true, the seeds of the true church and the reality, the fullness of the reality that represents, so that when we go through the attacks, the passion, and the life beyond the church, we have to start thinking about, we have to transcend ourselves beyond the attack of our day and see our true destiny beyond the passion of the church. And to do that, we have to really hold true to what the kingship of Christ means in its totality in the world, politically, socially, and for us individually. And we have to keep that in our hearts, and we have to guard what's true, and we have to be uncompromising about it. And it's so easy for someone just to say, well, who should I vote for then? There's a way we can have one foot in the world and maybe even still be involved in some extent to this phony baloney democratic process. But we can't lose ourselves in the mimetic pull. Christ revealed for us the scapegoat mechanism that has always pulled humanity down to the depths of what we saw in the ancient pagan world and where we're going again, child sacrifice. And that's where we're going again with all of this. And he revealed that mechanism so that we could, through baptism, grab the true destiny of the image that's inside of us and where it's going. So when the people are being scapegoated again, as they were in 9/11, and we're just letting the mimetic pull of the spectacle take us down to that level, we have to be able to recognize the image of Christ inside of us and the true destiny of that. And scapegoating other people is just a technique of this world. It's a very powerful, ancient technique, but Christ exposed that. Christ on Calvary is the true spectacle. Christ died for this. He destroyed sin. He created there a pathway so that the image of Christ in us can return. We can transcend sin. We can transcend politics. We can transcend even this very, very powerful mimetic pull, frankly, that's taken us down to the depths of hell. So Christ is the true spectacle. Christ is where we need to keep our focus. And it's Christ, especially living in the church and living in our own hearts. We need to walk in faith each day. And the reason I put these 5 steps out there is so that we can recognize them and recognize just because we ascribe to the label tradition or conservative, those things are designed by the devil to be a trap. We have pride in those labels. And really, at the end of the day, they don't mean much unless we live in the true church as it always has existed, and we are willing to live and protect the church in a fashion that is uncompromising. It doesn't compromise with the changes. And sometimes the idea of evolution is very, very, very subtle. But once we suggest that God somehow didn't get it right, we subtly ascribe to this. When we look the other way, we suddenly go with the flow, and we are unknowingly participating in the development of the anti-church. So we have to recognize this. We have to be on guard, and we have to walk in faith. The kingship of Christ. It's a fact. It's a true reality, whether we recognize it or not. So let's be on guard and let's be uncompromising. That has been Dr. Deep State for today. Those are the 5 signs of the anti-church and the reflections upon the true church of Christ and the leaven within the true church. It's certainly at least sunk into the traditional components of the church, and we have to be on guard for those. So I hope everybody's doing well. I don't know if this message is necessarily going to be received openly with some. I don't know if my book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse, I'm going to see open arms. And that's why, frankly, I need you guys to help me out, to back me up here in terms of what I'm saying, to hopefully get the book, to absorb the book, and maybe even to help me out in terms of some people that will be opening to listening to it and helping me promote the book. Thank you guys so much for the support you have given me. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. So God bless you guys.